Well, good morning, everyone. How are we doing today on this July 3rd? I'm John Mann, Director of Education for Lakeside, and I'm very happy to welcome back Paul Beck to Lakeside. Paul is a Professor Emeritus of Political Science and Senior Research Associate of the Mershon Center for National Security Studies, and is joining us all week to share multiple lectures on our theme, which is Preserving Democracy by the People. And today's session is Current Threats to Democracy. This lecture examines the most prominent threats to democracy. They include challenges to free and fair elections, an independent media, and the rule of law, militarization of the political system, bless you, and the threat or even reality of violence from opposite partisan sides in the contest for political power. Can't hear. Mike, could you turn up a little bit? Is this better? Okay. At the core of current threats to democracy lies a high degree of political polarization in many societies, including the U.S., that reduces partisan politics to a zero-sum struggle between friends and enemies. As a reminder, this evening in Hoover Auditorium, we'll be playing by air, and that's at 7:30. And as always, I do ask if you please mute your cell phone ringers and help me in welcoming Paul Beck.
Thank you very much, John. Good to see everybody here today. I was met on the street yesterday after my talk by somebody who said, you know, there's a mistake on your first slide. And I thought, oh no, that's not a good way to start. The mistake is that I refer to my affiliation as Ohio State University rather than the Ohio State University. And there's a story behind that. When I was on the active faculty after first coming here in 1987, I think it was the mid-90s, we were told by the president at the time that we now should refer to ourselves as being at the Ohio State University. And I had about 1,000 business cards printed up that only had Ohio State University on it, and they actually would not print them any longer unless they had the Ohio State University. Well, faculty being a fairly, how do I want to say, a contrarian bunch of people, mostly decided individually, we never talked about it, but mostly decided individually that we would not use the, that we would just refer to ourselves and our affiliation as Ohio State University. So there you have it. That's the story behind it.
But now you could have just the.
It could be the, that's right. Because I think it's now copyrighted, right? Yeah.
You know, a certain school up north, you generally refer to there as the university. Those two words.
Yes. Well, I'm a graduate of that school, so I never picked that up even when I was there. Well, again, it's really a delight to see all of you. What I'm going to do today is talk about threats to democracy, current threats to democracy. My previous talks, for those of you who attended them, were pretty much nonpartisan. I was simply describing the situation as it was, and I'll do that again today. But there's no way to give this talk on threats of democracy without being somewhat partisan. Because at least in my view, and you may disagree with me on this, but the threats to democracy that are posed right now come pretty much in one direction, or from one direction. And I'll talk about that. And what I owe you is my explanation as to why I think that way. And again, as I said, people are going to have different views on this, and that is perfectly okay. But you'll see this as I go along and develop this. Let me start out moving away from the United States for a minute, that these are troublesome times for democracy across the world. We are in a situation where there has been a rise of authoritarian governments. This was after a decade, by the way, where everybody was celebrating the movement in the direction of democracy all across the world. You know, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of the Soviet Union, and the like. it really seemed to be a very promising time for many citizens who had lived under the yoke of authoritarian governments to experience democracy for the first time. And there was that excitement that went along with that. Well, now we're in a different era. And if you look around the globe, a majority of the world's population now lives in authoritarian countries. Certainly leading, China leading the way. India is verging on authoritarianism. There was kind of a pushback, I guess, in the most recent election in India, but not a very powerful one. There are other countries around the world, as you pay attention to the news. Certainly Hungary is one. The Philippines is another one. Brazil recently, not so much right now, but previously. El Salvador, Venezuela, countries you may not pay much attention to. Iran, of course, is heavily authoritarian, as is Turkey. There are surging anti-democratic parties in 3 Western countries. France, this week, in fact, and the previous week, the right-wing party that for years and years and years carried the fascist emblem is now probably going to come in first in the runoff elections coming up. The same is true in terms of the rise of authoritarian movements in Germany, not as extensive as in France, but it's still there. Italy now has a leader who comes from the Brothers of Italy, which was a fascist party in its origins, has moved a bit more democratic, but not really very much. Now, she's turned out to be a pretty good leader, actually, and has, I think, mollified many of the fears that people had that she was going to be far more right-wing than they wanted, and far more anti-European community than they wanted. And she's been actually, at least from my vantage point, a pretty good leader for Italy. But again, we will see. Well, the United States faces threats to democracy itself. Probably the greatest threat since the Civil War. I wasn't around then. My students thought I was, but I had to disabuse them of that notion. But it's, as far as we can measure these things, we're in an era right now where there are greater threats to democracy here in this country than we have seen since the 1860s or 1850s. What I'm going to do is focus attention on what I think are the 4 most important of these threats to democracy, and I'll develop each of these points so you can see why I come to the conclusions that I come to. One has to do with the rule of law. The second one has to do with the electoral process that is unfolding in front of us right now and will proceed, of course, until the November 5th election. A third one has to do with governmental institutions and their threats for democracy, to democracy there. And then the fourth has to do with free and open political discourse. Let me talk first about the threats to the rule of law. And I want to go way back in history to talk about the barons in England in 2015 and the Magna Carta. They basically were given rights that the monarch had held before. And there was an expansion of democracy. This wasn't a very democratic country in 1215, but the Magna Carta established rights for them that they had not previously enjoyed. And so the Magna Carta is looked upon as one of the fundamental documents in the development of democracy. And of course, carried over to this country, as the English settled this country, they carry these kinds of privileges and rights with them to these shores, but not completely. And so we rebelled against that in the 1700s and basically kicked out the king and became, of course, a republic ourselves. The U.S. Constitution establishes those rights also to the rule of law. The Fifth Amendment is the key due process amendment to the Constitution. It gets reaffirmed in the 14th Amendment, which basically brought former slaves into citizenship in the United States. And the quote there that I pulled from the Fifth Amendment is, "No one shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without the process of law." There are attacks on the legal system right now certainly this year, but in previous years as well. It's the legal system that enforces due process, right? And these attacks undermine the rule of law. They undermine the rule of law in serious ways. They're personal attacks that are focused on judges, clerks, lawyers in the courtroom that are basically involved in the judicial process to try to guarantee due process. There are attempts at intimidation of trial juries and witnesses. There is even defiance of judicial orders. Steve Bannon right now is in prison because he defied a subpoena from the Congress. He could have shown up and taken the Fifth Amendment if he wanted to, but he simply was defiant there. And there have been other instances of that as well. Under the U.S. Constitution, the federal judiciary, of course, is designed to be independent of the executive, the third branch of government. A branch, by the way, the framers didn't really think was going to end up being very powerful, but it's turned out to be very powerful and very important in the constellation of institutions. Judges, federal judges, are insulated by Senate confirmation, insulated from the president. They are lifetime appointments. They serve as long as they want to or until they die. So they're there for forever in some cases, it seems. Some judges have become more openly partisan recently. Now we need to realize that all of them, when they are nominated by a president, are partisans in some way or another. Presidents don't typically nominate people from the other party for these kinds of positions. But in the past, they have nominated people who have been highly recommended by the American Bar Association, which comprises a list of people, many of them judges in the lower courts. That has changed over time. President Trump, when he was looking for appointees or people he wanted to nominate to the Supreme Court, simply refused to accept the ABA recommendations and went instead to another organization called the Federalist Society. And he basically took their list and worked on that list. So that's been a big change and a recent change. Biden went back to the American Bar Association recommendations and, of course, did not depend upon the Federalist Society. There also are threats to undermine the Justice Department that over time, and of course you're all aware of the decision that came down on Monday, and one of the elements of that decision was that the president has a right, part of the presidential power, official power, to deal directly with the Justice Department. And the truth is he's always had that right. What has changed is that now it's much more out in the open. There was a norm in the past that the Justice Department really didn't want to receive orders from the White House. There was one case where, at least one that I know of, and that was during the Nixon administration. You'll remember the Saturday Night Massacre, some of you. That was where the President Nixon in this case, wanted them to, if I remember correctly, get rid of the special counsel. I don't think he was called that at the time. And several attorneys general refused to do that and resigned. And the one that did accept the order from the White House, who was later a nominee to the Supreme Court, Bork was his last name, was somebody who was willing to follow through with what President Nixon wanted. So that was an instance where there was an attempt on the part of the White House to try to control the Justice Department and order it to do certain things that were in the interest of the president. And of course, what the Supreme Court was saying on Monday is that that is part of the authority that a president has. I don't think that's changed much, but it does undermine the norm, okay? The norm is no longer there. A second threat is threats to the electoral process. And I'm going to say more about this. Free and fair elections are a centerpiece of democracy, and their legitimacy is threatened. Certainly threatened in authoritarian countries, because authoritarian leaders, Putin in Russia, Orban in Hungary, and others, have tried to undercut free and fair elections. In Putin's case, by controlling who the candidates are. In the case of Iran, by controlling who the candidates are, by not allowing certain candidates who might challenge the rulers any access to the ballots. That's one way they do that, and I'll talk more about that. But we also see this in the United States, and the threats in some ways are threefold. One has to do with who votes. Who should be eligible to vote in our elections? It's an issue in the United States. It's rarely an issue in other democracies. That's pretty much settled in other democracies. But there's been a battle going on back and forth between largely Democrats who believe in easy access to the ballot, very few restrictions as to who ought to vote. Certainly citizens, that's one restriction. You have to be a citizen to vote, but they want to make it easier for people to cast a ballot. In a country, by the way, where in presidential elections, turnout is about 60% of people who are eligible to vote. That's not very high. Other countries have much higher levels of turnout than we do. And Republicans, on the other hand, not all of them, obviously, and not in every state, nonetheless have been worried more about fraudulent voting, and they have tried to devise ways to cut back on the amount of fraudulent voting that takes place. There turns out to be, and this has been heavily studied, certainly by political scientists, turns out to be very little fraudulent voting. Occasionally it crops up. I have one personal anecdote that I like to share with people, and that is when I lived in Florida, we were at a neighborhood party, and one of our neighbors walked over and he said, "Well, I hear you're a political scientist." I said, "Well, yes, I am." And he said, "Well, you should know I vote twice. I vote here in Florida and I vote in Ohio." Turns out he was from Columbus, Ohio. And he said, "I have property in both places, and so I have a vested interest in who is elected to office in each place." And my response was, "That's illegal." And I should have turned him in, but I didn't. He was a neighbor. I was going to turn in a neighbor there. So there are examples of that. And in fact, I think the most common form of illegal voting probably is people who are voting in more than one state. And again, it's very few people do that. Most of us, when we move from, let's say, if we live in Ohio and we move to Florida and establish residence there, we don't think to go back to Ohio and cancel our registration there because we've moved. We've got too many other things in our mind, right? But there are ways that the election authorities in these various states are able to purge the rolls of people who have moved out of the state. Ohio doesn't now do it in the way that most states do. It used to be that states would share their registration rolls with one another, and then you could just basically go through those and find out that there were people who were on the registration rolls in Ohio who really were living in Arizona or Florida and hadn't voted in elections, and most of them didn't, and you could purge them from the rolls. Well, we ended that just a year or so ago, ended that kind of cooperation with other states. I don't know why. I don't think it made much sense, but we nonetheless did that. So there have been battles between the two parties, basically, over who is eligible to vote. And you see it played out in a variety of ways, through registration rules. The state of Ohio, by the way, in the early 1900s, had no registration rules. All you did was show up at the polls, and you were able to vote. And the reason for that, I think, probably was that people who were manning the polls in those days knew everybody who was in that particular precinct. And if you marched up to the polls and tried to vote and they knew you weren't a citizen, or they knew that you were only 14 years of age and weren't eligible to vote by age, they could catch you there. But we adopted registration rules in Ohio mainly to undercut the power of the political machines in some of the cities. Cincinnati, Cleveland, Columbus maybe, Toledo, and so forth. And the feeling was at the time that in these major urban areas, the political bosses were getting people to the polls to vote more than once, and of course to vote the right way. I grew up near Chicago, and the adage that came out from Chicago that we would read about is vote early and vote often. And that was the sustenance of the political machine there. So there are reasons to tighten registration. There are reasons to be careful about who it is who is eligible to vote. And I've listed there a variety of ways that we do that. There are purges of the voter rolls, purges that are taking place right now here in Ohio. People who haven't voted in recent years are contacted at the address that's listed there and asked, are you still an eligible voter in Ohio? In most cases, the Secretary of State's office never gets a response because people have moved on and the post office is no longer forwarding their mail. So purges are necessary. The rolls need to be cleaned up, and they need to be cleaned up because, believe it or not, people sometimes die. Can you imagine that? And don't report in when they have passed away that they no longer are eligible to vote. Voter ID is something that has become very popular in some states in recent years, where we have to show an identification at the polls. Some things qualify, driver's licenses, for example. Military IDs would qualify. In some states, student IDs do not qualify you to be able to pass the voter ID test. So again, another way to try to control access to the ballot. Absentee voting deadlines have been changed over time. It used to be that it was very hard to vote absentee. You had to demonstrate to the local board of elections that you really were absent. You were going to be away on business. You couldn't vote on election day, and the elections, and maybe some of those states were elections that were held on election day itself. Now absentee voting has been very much liberalized. Many people prefer that, by the way. Absentee voting can be early voting, that's absentee, or it can be voting by mail. And many states make it really easy for people to vote absentee, and voters like that. They particularly liked it during the pandemic for reasons that I think all of us can understand. And in fact, many states liberalized their rules about where you could vote and when you could vote during the pandemic period, mainly because you didn't want people congregating in polling places trying to cast a ballot there. And then many states, after the pandemic was over, went back and took away some of those liberal provisions. The one that comes to mind immediately is there used to be, during the pandemic, multiple drop boxes in most counties where you could cast an absentee ballot and then just drop it in the box, and you could be pretty sure that it was going to get counted there. Some states simply did away with that, or in Ohio, I think now, there can only be one drop box per county. So if you lived in Cuyahoga County, there's one drop box. If you lived in some tiny county somewhere in a rural area of the state, there's one drop box. If you live in Cuyahoga County, Cuyahoga, and there is a drop box in the western part of the county, you have to drive all the way there if you want to drop your ballot in a box there. So that's been a change as well. There also have been challenges to student voting on campus with the recognition that students are easily mobilized by one party or the other, or one candidate or another. And that could be to the detriment of the opposing party or the opposing candidates. When I lived in Ann Arbor some years ago, students could not vote on campus in Ann Arbor. If you were from the state of Michigan, you would go back home to vote, or you could cast an absentee ballot, although it wasn't easy to do that. And most students were much more interested in things other than applying early for an absentee ballot. If you were from out of state, you had to go out of state to vote or vote absentee there. Well, the state Supreme Court struck that down as unconstitutional. And then in Ann Arbor, and this would have been the late 60s, all of a sudden students on campus could vote. And they swarmed to the ballot boxes and elected a city council that had students on it. That city council almost immediately legalized marijuana. As you can imagine, what do the students care about in that era? Well, they legalized marijuana. They didn't totally, okay. They eliminated the fine? Is that what it was?
They made a fine that was equivalent to a minor
Okay, okay. And students were eagerly paying that, I'm sure. Okay. Flat legalization. Okay, good, good. I'll fold that into my anecdote in the future. The other thing, by the way, that happened was that the people who were in favor of relaxing the marijuana laws were voted out in the next city council elections, or at least some of them. The majority then voted away or voted out that particular legalization provision of the law. And so Ann Arbor went back to normal times compared to what it was during that brief episode. Well, I didn't mean to dwell on that so much, but I thought you would appreciate that there still is an effort, you see it here in Ohio, to try to make it very difficult for students to vote on campus and to force them, if they are Ohio residents, either to vote absentee by going back home or to apply for an absentee ballot. And as I said before, there were these rollbacks and some of the most stringent requirements during the pandemic, recognizing that people didn't want to assemble in places when COVID-19 was afflicting so many people, and they wanted to make it easy for people to vote there. Okay, so there are differences between parties and different interests in who votes. There are also differences in who counts the votes. And here we're talking largely, and again, there are 50 different states that have elections, and each state has its own rules in effect. There's some similarity across states, but there are some major differences as well. The traditional US model has been to basically set up boards of elections that have equal representation of Democrats and Republicans, on the notion that that's the best way to guard against electoral fraud, is to make sure that the vote counters are represented, or both sides are represented among the vote counters. I think that model has worked really well, actually. I gave a talk a few years ago to people from the boards of elections around the state of Ohio, and these were the professionals in the boards of election offices, and they were really professionals. They wanted to get it right. They wanted to make sure the elections were fair and free in their particular county. I've heard from a couple of them in the last several months who are decrying what's happened in terms of assaults, attacks on members of the boards of elections, with, in one county here in Ohio, the publication of their home addresses and phone numbers so that people could contact them to complain about what was going on there. It's not a very pretty picture, and it's been very difficult for them to recruit, for the boards of elections, to recruit poll watchers, people who will run the polls, maintain the polls at election time, because there's risk now. There's risk that was never there before. So there is an attempt to move away from that model. Exactly where it's going to go, I don't know. One anecdote that I'll share with you is that there was an article, I believe it was in the New York Times, about the head of the Board of Elections in a Nevada county, a very conservative Republican. She would not say that the election in that county was fraudulent. She refused to do that. And she now is subject to recall. And it looked like, at least according to the report by the reporter who was doing this story for the New York Times, it looked like she indeed was going to be recalled. And she was recounting in this article all the kinds of threats that she had received from her neighbors and from fellow Republicans. And it was really a sad kind of spectacle as you read about this situation. Well, this is going on in other places around the country as well. And it's very unfortunate. Personal attacks, threats of violence that are targeting people who are administering the elections. And then there even is a dispute over who should certify the results. This played out, of course, at the tail end of the 2020 election, and you all probably followed this in the news. There were questions as to whether they should be certified by the governor in a state, or should the legislature be the one that actually certified the elections. There have been proposals for other kinds of certifications. There was a feeling on the part of some that the certification really ought to be left to the Vice President of the United States as he was presiding over the vote counting in early January. The vote counting, of course, was under attack at that very time in the U.S. Capitol. Well, as we look at 2024, we are finding that there is activity on the part of both campaigns, both presidential campaigns, both parties, preparing for litigation over eligibility to vote, over vote counting, and over certification of the results. And I think what we can expect to see both before the election as well as after the election, all kinds of suits, depending, of course, on who has won. But there may even be some suits from people who have won the election, but they're not really happy with the result for maybe some other office that is on the ballot. The other thing, just to wind this up in terms of the electoral process itself, is that the tradition, since 1876 at least, has been to accept the result even if you're not very happy about it. Richard Nixon was in that situation in 1960. There is some evidence that he actually won that election, but that he didn't win Illinois and Texas because of fraudulent activity in the counting of ballots. And in fact, I remember, I grew up near Chicago, and I remember reading about the trucks full of ballot boxes that were traveling around the city of Chicago for several days after the election. And in fact, I think the Chicago Tribune, which was at the time a conservative paper, had a cartoon of Mayor Daley's hench people stuffing the ballot boxes, asking, well, how many votes do you need to be able to win the election for John Kennedy in Illinois? And there was a similar situation in Texas as well. But Nixon basically conceded the election result. And maybe he thought he would by conceding, he would be able to run again for president, and he did, and of course won in 1968. And then Al Gore, again, in the Florida situation in 2000, had reasons to feel that the election result was really something that was denied him ultimately by the Supreme Court, but he accepted the result and was quite willing to accept the certification that, in this case, the Supreme Court had promoted. Trump and his allies, of course, have questioned the 2020 result to this day, in fact, and they'll continue doing that. And they've used support for the illegitimacy of that election and its claims as a loyalty test for people. And most Republican candidates for office have signed on to that, have basically parroted the denial of the legitimacy of the 2020 election. Trump has threatened to challenge the results if he loses. The question is, will Biden challenge the results if he loses and thinks it was the result of a fraudulent vote count? He could. My guess is that if he is still the candidate in November, he won't do that. But indeed, he could. There's a precedent for that. If reelected, by the way, ex-President Trump has promised to pardon the hostages, quote, end quote, as he refers to them, who were convicted of federal crimes in the January 6th attack on Congress and related efforts to overturn the contest in 2020. And he has also pledged openly, he's made no bones about this, that he will quash the continuing Justice Department investigations of him and some of his supporters coming out of the 2020 election. Okay, let me turn from the electoral process to threats for governmental institutions. And there's a lot here, and I want to make sure I talk fairly fast so that I can get through all of this. To avoid another king, the framers were very concerned with separating national powers. They didn't want to endow a president with the kinds of powers that they had really resisted under the king, under King George. And so they built in these kinds of qualifiers to presidential power. Notably, by the way, the second article of the Constitution is the presidential article, not the first article. The first article is the congressional article. And the framers actually thought that Congress would be the driving force of the national government. The president would be important, and they didn't want to cripple him in terms of powers. But again, they are very detailed in what powers he could exercise and which ones he would not be able to exercise. There now is an alternative theory to what I'll call the framers' theory about the presidency. And it's the unitary executive theory. And you heard a lot about this in 2020. You're hearing a lot about it today. And it gives the president absolute power over the executive branch of government. But it's beyond the executive branch, actually. It also involves the regulatory agencies, the Federal Reserve, some of the agencies that are regulating, the quality of the environment, or the Securities and Exchange Commission as a regulatory agency. All of those under the unitary executive theory would be brought into the control of the White House. And that's the purpose of this theory. The blueprint for this is something that was issued by the Heritage Foundation called Project 2025. And every 4 years they have issued a report. And it hasn't changed a lot over time. But the report that was just issued again is to, quote, reshape the federal government to support a Republican president. The Heritage Foundation is a conservative organization, not the only one, and it has rivals in Washington, D.C. that are not as conservative as it is. But what they propose are the following things, and I want you to bear these in mind. They propose cuts to the Justice Department, radical cuts to the Justice Department and to the FBI, and to Homeland Security, the Homeland Security Department, to the CIA. They propose cuts to climate and environmental regulations. They propose to eliminate the Departments of Commerce and Education. They want to, as I said, bring the independent agencies under full presidential control. They also call for reduced spending for the social safety net. That includes Social Security and Medicare, by the way, certainly includes Medicaid, but other kinds of social safety net programs as well. They would enact conservative social policies, and they're quite open about saying that. This, by the way, is a 900-page report. I finally managed to read all of it, so I speak having fallen asleep multiple times as I was going through it. But it's out there, and if you want to see it, it is there for anybody to read. There are other provisions as well that have been talked about. Some of them are in the Project 2025 report. One is that the president be able to use the Insurrection Act to incorporate or build the military or depend upon the military in local law enforcement, to mobilize the National Guard, for example, to police the streets in major cities, to make sure that Cleveland, Cincinnati, Columbus, Chicago, and whatever have troops on the ground who are also trying to enforce the laws in those cities. They also want to politicize the Justice Department to investigate the president's adversaries. And you hear this quite directly from former President Trump. In fact, one of the first things he would want to do is first quash the investigations of him, but secondly, put his people in place in the Justice Department to go after, and he's been very bold in saying this. Whether he's going to do it or not is another matter, but he certainly says he's going to do this. There also is an attempt, and this is in the Heritage Foundation report, to create a pool of conservatives. The target for them is 20,000 of these names. And these would be people that would be drawn into the new administration, and they would be loyalists. And the feeling is, and in fact, ex-President Trump has said this himself, is that he wasn't really ready to staff the federal executive the way that he wanted to, because of course he had no background there. And so, and in fact, I'll tell you this, you may remember this, that he had tasked Chris Christie to draw up a list of people who could be appointed to the various federal departments and agencies under a Trump presidency. And then he and his immediate staff took a look at the list. They fired Chris Christie. They deep sixed the list, and they developed their own list, but they developed it pretty much on the fly. And they weren't really sure who these people were and how loyal they would be. Over time, he was moved more and more towards people who would be loyal to him. And certainly they're going to be prepared in 2025 to make sure that the people that they are installing in these top government positions, both the cabinet secretaries but also undersecretaries and some of the assistant and associate secretaries as well, the policymakers in these various federal agencies. They also are threatening to use the military to jail enemies and to create camps for undocumented immigrants to get them out of the country, basically. It's there, and you can see it in this Project 2025 report. What all of this means, as I think about it, is a return to the kinds of patronage practices at the federal level that we had in the 19th century, whereas newly elected presidents in the 19th century would appoint their people to the few federal government positions that existed. These were mostly tax collectors at the ports, as well as federal attorneys, U.S. attorneys in the various jurisdictions around the country. They wanted their people there. The feeling was at the time, on the part of people who didn't really like that practice, that what you needed to do was institute civil service regulations that would govern the people who held some of those positions, many of those positions, so that they were not necessarily presidential loyalists. They were people who were professional bureaucrats, professionals in those various agencies, and wouldn't have to kick back a percentage of their salary, as they were asked to do in the patronage era, to the president's party. I grew up in Indiana, and in Indiana there was something called the Mace. And the Mace was a kickback of, I think it was 2% of your salary to the party that was in charge, that had been the party that had basically given you the recommendation to get that particular position. That's now gone in Indiana. But even when I was a high school student, I had friends who worked for the county road crews in the summer. They had to give back 2% of their salary to the particular party that was running the county at that time. So it would be a return to those patronage practices from before. These would be people who were loyal to the president. They would be put in positions and could be dismissed if a new president took office, and then they would be expected to be loyal to that president. So it's a real change and a movement away from the kind of good government practices that were adopted at the tail end of the 19th century. And there was active talk about reclassifying many civil service workers so that they would fall under this provision that they could be dismissed at the will of the president, essentially, and replaced. There's a claim of unlimited presidential immunity. The Supreme Court on Monday basically rendered a decision here. It wasn't much of a surprise to me because I think there's certain areas of the president's official duties where a president should be immune from prosecution, should be immune from suits. But there are other areas that are kind of in the middle there where they are not necessarily areas where a president ought to be immune from suits. Presidents, I don't think, you just think out loud here, have ever been sued before modern times. And you don't want them to be sued for sending troops to, I don't know, to Haiti to put down gang violence there, and somebody is killed. Should they be sued for that? You don't want that to happen. But there are other areas that I think are more marginal, and certainly when it comes to personal acts on the part of a president, maybe a president should be subject to suit in those particular kinds of actions. There also is a threat, and again, you've heard this, and by the way, most of what I'm talking about are things that come from presidential candidates, namely Donald Trump and maybe others as well, when they're campaigning, things that have been pledged by them. And so I'm pretty much relying upon their rhetoric and their comments. Ex-President Trump has threatened to abrogate treaty obligations. The primary one is to NATO, and he would get rid of that. There was an obligation when he took office to the Paris Accords in terms of climate change. He walked the U.S. out of those accords very early on. He said he was going to do it during the campaign, and voters certainly should have been aware that he was going to do that. He's also talked about imposing high tariffs, certainly on Chinese goods, but on other goods as well. The problem with that, by the way, if you think about it, is that we pay the tariffs. It's a sales tax, in effect. And sure, it will cut down on the trade with these other countries, but it will cut down in a way that raises the price of those goods in a way that we may not really prefer. So it's important, I think, to realize that. Trump, in a Time magazine interview where he was very revealing to the interviewer, kind of doubled down on many of these pledges. And again, if you want to read about what he would do when he comes into office, read this Time magazine interview. There are things in it he might have regretted that he said, but he nonetheless said them and may well act on them. Overall, what the Project 2025 proposes, a report proposes, and what ex-President Trump himself has said undermine the norms against favoritism in executive actions. These would be policies that would be based on transactional advantages and on loyalty to the president. His would be, and he said this, a presidency primarily motivated by the desire for retribution against people that he regarded as his enemies. If the Heritage Foundation and Trump plans are enacted, the result would be a much more powerful president and an unconstrained president in many ways. If you prefer that, you're going to like what is done. If you don't prefer that, you're going to worry about that, but it's there and it's certainly part of the proposals. The other threat to democracy that I want to talk about are threats to free and open discourse. And the framers recognize the importance of freedom of speech, First Amendment to the Constitution, and of assembly. The authoritarian playbook, as it's been worked out in other countries, tries to control the narrative, tries to control the flow of information. And presidents like Orban in Hungary, like Erdogan in Turkey, certainly Putin in Russia, have very, very much wanted to make sure that any kind of dissent is not expressed, or at least not expressed in a widespread way. They've undermined independent media by attacking media that are critical of them as enemies of the people, quote, end quote. And this is language they use, by the way. Loyal media are enlisted to support the authoritarian leader. The best example there came out of this Manhattan trial, and that's the National Enquirer, not a newspaper that I think most of you probably read on a regular basis. And I don't even think it's available anymore at Kroger's, so you can't read it while you're standing in the line there to pay for your groceries. But the National Enquirer was doing what? Several things. One is they were running articles that were basically attacking in very vicious ways anybody who was an opponent to Donald Trump, either during the primaries, these were Republican opponents, or during the general election campaign when he was running against Hillary Clinton, or later on when he was running against Joe Biden. And then they also were running articles that were very favorable towards ex-President Trump. And so they're a good example of a media that was basically doing his bidding, in effect, and was part of his campaign. And there are others. You know, there certainly are media outlets out there that are favorable towards one party or another. We all know what those are. Probably Fox News on the conservative or Republican side, MSNBC on the liberal and Democratic side. If we are interested in having our views reinforced, we get our news from them, right? If, on the other hand, we're interested in finding news that is more balanced and even-handed, I don't quite know where we go. Maybe we go to the old networks and pay attention to them, and they do try to balance the news as much as they can. There also would be some talk of challenging the licenses to the three major broadcast networks, ABC, NBC, CBS. Challenging those licenses because the argument would be they are not balanced in their coverage of the news. There's also a lot of talk, an interesting talk, by the way, about eliminating any funding for public broadcasting, because public broadcasting also tries to be even-handed, tries to be balanced in its presentation of the news. The big defenders of public broadcasting, by the way, are people who live, or members of Congress, I should say, who live in small towns and rural areas where the public broadcast stations may be the only ones that are bringing them news. And they have protected public broadcasting in a way that many of their, in this case, Republican colleagues haven't been very happy about. And that, I think, will continue over time. A second thing that I want to talk about is that there has been an unleashing of disinformation to mold reality, to try to create reality, to provide fake news to people that encourages a receptivity to what are called alternate facts. Powerful leaders have powerful megaphones, particularly the President of the United States. And if over and over and over again they're saying a particular thing, voters are inclined to be cued to that. They're inclined to believe that, and inclined to, if it's disinformation, to accept that. We know that there also has been a lot of foreign meddling in our election. Foreign meddling from Russia, foreign meddling from Iran, foreign meddling from North Korea, foreign meddling from a variety of other places, Hungary to some degree. Russia probably does the most of that. Some of that foreign meddling has been picked up by members of Congress and repeated, even though it is classic disinformation created in the labs in Moscow or the vicinity of Moscow. And that's a very, very dangerous kind of thing. What they're trying to do is sow chaos, trying to turn Americans against one another in the kinds of messages that they are conveying. And again, that is a threat to democracy. And then there's campaign spending. There is a lot of dark money that flows into campaigns. What I'm reading is that the Senate contest in Ohio is going to be one in which there is probably upwards of $100 million spent on behalf of each candidate. Much of it not spent by the candidates' campaigns themselves, but by these so-called dark money political action committees that never divulge who their donors are. And that money is going to be flowing into TV advertising in the Ohio campaign. It's a corrosive kind of thing. And there's so much money now flowing through these campaigns, to the delight of TV stations, by the way, that are benefiting enormously from it. Because, interestingly, if they are running candidate campaigns, they have to charge the candidate campaigns the lowest fee for their ads. But they don't have to charge political action committees and other independent spenders those low fees. And so in some cases, Mitt Romney ran to this, by the way, when he was president, that he had tried to finance a lot of his ads through political action committees. And in Ohio, they were paying 4 times as much for an ad as they would have paid if it had come through or been placed by the Romney campaign. They realized this too late because they'd been encouraging people to donate money to the political action committees rather than the campaign itself, because there are limits as to how much you and I as ordinary citizens can donate to a candidate campaign. Somewhere right now between $5,000 and $6,000 per election, whereas a political action committee can spend hundreds of millions of dollars if it wants to on behalf of or against another candidate. Okay, there is a degradation of language of political discourse. We all see this. We all wince when we hear it, perhaps. Vicious, incessant personal attacks on opponents, particularly by these political action committees. Candidates are not really inclined to want to be vicious in their ads themselves because they don't want to be held responsible for that. They would rather kind of float above that viciousness. You demonize opponents as hated enemies rather than just adversaries who happen to disagree on policy matters. There's a persistent use of what are called false equivalences to depict the other side as just as bad as you are in terms of how it's waging a campaign. And that has an effect of undermining the legitimacy of the political process, right? We all see that and we all hear that. Lies and spins overwhelm facts. Politicians always spin things in their favor. We know that. Some spin more than others. And some spin, well, I don't want to say it quite that way. Some only spin things. And it's very hard to figure out just exactly where they stand on something. And all of this undermines the norms for civility that are the guardrails of democracy. Well, let me conclude. If reelected, the question is, will the Trump threats to democracy increase over time once he's in office? I think past behavior and his campaign rhetoric and the plans show ominous authoritarian signs. And he's even said this himself, actually. His election may also result from anti-democratic electoral attacks. It may be fraudulent in a sense. Will Biden contest that? If Biden is indeed the Democratic nominee, we'll have to see. How will Trump's hostile takeover change the Republican Party? It already has. The Republican Party really is the party of Donald Trump. And you can see this. You can see this in terms of who the major Republican leaders are in the Congress, who they are basically turning to as they're trying to craft policy positions. And I think that change has already taken place. A Trump presidency dominated by revenge and retribution would not be a pretty presidency to see. And also what's happening is that party funds that have been donated by Republican loyalists to the Republican National Committee now are being siphoned off to pay for Trump's legal bills and to pay for some of the things in his campaign. The other thing that he's done is he's asked all Republican candidates for office who are using his endorsement as part of their campaign to kick back 5% of the money they raise to him, to his political action committee, not actually to his campaign. And I think there are a lot of Republican candidates for office that are very upset with that, feeling that they shouldn't be using money that they have raised to support them and their candidacy to push it over to President Trump. Biden has different policy goals, and I think voters can take that into account as they cast ballots. They may be policy goals they don't agree with, and so they would vote against him. But he doesn't really threaten democracy itself. The threat there is different policies, not democracy. Equally serious are threats to dismantle the constitutional order. Framers refused to give presidents powers of a king claimed under the unitary executive theory and the presidential immunity claim. And I think checks on presidential power would wither in Congress, particularly if it was a Republican Congress in both houses. They, I think, have already signaled that they would follow the leader. They would follow President Trump were he to be elected as president. Let me conclude on this point. The historical lesson is that authoritarian leaders are empowered because elites are complicit with them. They go along with them. In Germany, the military leaders as well as the industrial elites thought Hitler, he's nobody. We'll be able to control him once he gets into office. They quickly found out that they couldn't, and there were attempts to try to assassinate him, all of them unsuccessful. But nonetheless, they weren't really happy with what they got, but they were complicit early on. A clever authoritarian leader creates loyalists through giving benefits that are coming from the executive branch itself. Contracts of one kind or another, positions of one sort or another, ambassadorships and the like. And loyalists are installed in governmental positions. There is little evidence, as I've said before, and you see this, that Republican leaders will resist if Trump is president. Establishment Republicans have been replaced by Trump loyalists. The question is, why have Republican leaders followed Trump? In some cases, it's support for policies. It's opposition to the policies of a Democratic administration. It's a desire for lower taxes, for example, or less regulation of business. And these have been legitimate issues of discourse in electoral campaigns going way back in time. And so support for policies motivates some people, I think, to vote for Trump. Moderates and Trump opponents have been replaced in the leadership of the party. And there's a fear of electoral retribution from the Republican voter base. And those, I think, are three pretty powerful reasons. What authoritarian control does is it creates voter apathy. Many voters, many citizens just give up. And the problem, of course, with an authoritarian leader is that an authoritarian leader doesn't use due process to deny people particular rights, to seize their property, to jail them for one reason or another. It is really at the whim of the authoritarian leader. And you saw this in Nazi Germany. You saw this in Italy as well under Mussolini. You're seeing this in Hungary today. You see this in Turkey to a lesser degree. You certainly see it in Russia. And so the authoritarian playbook is something to be paid attention to. One hopes we will not see it here. Well, let me stop on that point. I probably, again, talked too long. I hope there's time for questions. John says there is. So please have at it. He's coming with a microphone.
We have this discussion every 4 years. Is there still a case to be made for the Electoral College? And if not, do you foresee a path forward to eliminating it?
Yeah, I think the question is there a path for changing the Electoral College? I think it has unfortunate results, but it is, of course, in the Constitution. And so to change it in any major way, we would have to amend the Constitution. And the states that are benefited by the Electoral College, which are usually the less populated, well, always the less populated states, are not going to support that kind of change because all of a sudden they wouldn't matter at all in a presidential contest. So I think we just have to live with it. One thing that could change that would be, I think, a useful reform is if the states would require that for somebody to get the electoral votes from that state, they have to get a majority of the popular vote in that state. And that could be a possibility, and that would be permitted under the Constitution. but it doesn't seem like it's going to happen very soon. Yes, question over here. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I want to thank you for your time and for giving this lecture. My question centers a little bit about public debate and discourse here. You know, your talk here, you know, you started out by saying that all threats of democracy come in one direction. I think anybody having any sort of intellectual debate would say that wouldn't even pass this sniff test. That's not even a way to start a debate. I would say that, you know, when we have this debate, how are we going to, you know, you basically demonized half the country that doesn't agree with you. There's nothing you said on there that doesn't demonize half the country. And so my question is then, how do we start having intellectual discussions and be honest about some of these issues? So, you know, I'm not going to debate each and everything, but just to give a couple things, you know, again, I don't think this is funny, but, you know, if we go through one, you spoke about rule of law. You spoke about Steve Bannon is being sent to court for being in contempt. You know, you could mention Merrick Garland stands in contempt currently. Eric Holder was in contempt of court under Obama for not coming for Fast and Furious again. I'm not debating any of those things. I'm just saying that in having a civil, intellectual debate about this, those would be very pertinent. Those were not brought up at all. You know, saying that somebody was arrested who was driving to the house of Justice Kavanaugh to kill him. That person was arrested. People are currently protesting on his lawn, on the other justice's lawn, undermining the rule of law. If you want to talk about the President of the United States the other day when the rulings came down from the Supreme Court, a standing President of the United States spoke against the third one, which is rarely. Normally Congress and the President have back and forth. It's rare that that happens with the justice system, yet he did that. We have AOC saying they're undermining democracy. So rule of law, you know, I'm not here to debate one side or another, but I'm here to say that in an honest debate, we might mention some other sides. For the electoral side, you say that you know, that somehow that saying that we should have you know, be clear on who's voting. We know that President Biden this last election won by about 14,000 votes in the swing states, which is how he won the election. We know that Bush, when he won, was about 300 votes. So you know, again, that is saying who should vote and, you know, isn't to be poo-pooed or we're trying to make people not vote. And again, I'm trying to be brief here. Just going to three, I'm just saying one or two comments. You know, about the institutions, you know, this idea of pulling away from the Paris Accords. I'm speaking to him, thank you. So if you know, you're pulling out of the Paris Accords, you know, pulling out of NATO, he was president for 4 years. He didn't pull out of NATO. But, you know, just an elementary discussion on why you might pull out of NATO in terms of who's paying for all of it, in terms of Paris Peace Accords, who's the #1 producers of pollution, and who's paying for all of that. You know, just any of those things would say, oh, well, wait a second, maybe, you know, there's another side. And then for the fourth one, you know, about, you know, communication and, you know, and suppressing conversation, there could be a debate about, you know, again, I'm not here to debate what is, but Hunter Biden laptop. And so I'm going to finish here. And so, you know, and then, you know, I'm speaking to him, ma'am. If you want to have a question, you can stand up and raise your hand. And so my question, I'll go back to my first one, is that just in having a reasonable, polite conversation about this, this comes across as nowhere near that. There was no grace. There was no space for anybody on the other side. Some of these things, like, you know, just how you've written them aren't there at all. So my question to you is, as someone who comes in and gives a lecture, you know, as somebody, you know, a professor emeritus, OSU, you know, an authority, how do we have some sort of kind of polite town hall discourse on something like this? Thank you.
Okay, there is.
White male.
I'm sorry.
No, we don't need to go there. I understand your points, and I'm not going to respond to them individually because you saw my talk there. I didn't mean to say, and I hope you didn't interpret me this way, that all the threats to democracy come from one side of the aisle. I think the predominance of them do. I don't think they come from most Republicans, but they do come from Donald Trump, and I think he's made no bones about that. What I've tried to do is rely, for the particular points that I've made, rely on things that he has either said or has done. Now, sometimes he engages in really exaggerated rhetoric, I think mostly to make the other side upset. And these may not be things that he would end up doing if he were to be elected to office. I think probably in his second term, if elected, the wraps would be off. And he might engage in things that he didn't think of doing or that he was blocked from doing by his own people in government. If you pay attention to many of the cabinet officials under Trump who have come out to say we cannot endorse him and it would be awful if he is elected as president, you'll understand what they were trying to do when they were working under him in those offices. So I'm not going to go on and on about that, but I think that we should be vigilant to threats to democracy wherever they come from. And sometimes these threats will come from people on the left, sometimes they'll come from people on the right. I've not been somebody who has wanted to say that we shouldn't be careful about who votes in an election, whereas I think there's some people would say just let anybody vote who wants to. No, I think citizens ought to be the ones who vote. I make no bones about that. So sometimes people go too far. One other point I wanted to make is that you've seen on the extremes of both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, people who were very opposed to the rest of their party and their party's leaders. Democrats, I think, have done a fairly good job in the Congress in trying to contain those extremes. Republican leaders have been unable to contain those extremes. And Congress, particularly in the House of Representatives, policy is driven on the Republican side by just a handful of people who are opposed to a majority of Republican members of Congress. And that's not a good thing for the Republican Party, and it's certainly not a good thing for the country. So let me stop there and take other questions.
I have a quick question. If you think of the Heritage 2025 report as a manifesto, I don't know if you believe that. Of course, it's awfully long, so most people won't read it. What would be the equivalent thing for the Democratic Party as for people to perceive the difference?
You know, I guess I don't know of a Democratic Party manifesto like, equivalent to what the Heritage Foundation has done. It might be the Democratic Party platform as it's enacted at the convention. The Republicans in 2020 did not enact a platform. They basically said we will support whatever candidate Trump, President Trump in that case, wants to do. And I understand that. The Democrats, I think, will be debating a large variety of policies at the 2024 convention. It'll be interesting to see how that turns out. But there is no other group like the Heritage Foundation, or parallel, I should say, on the Democratic side. There are a lot of voices there, and a lot of organizations that are voicing various kinds of policy positions or giving voice to various kinds of policy positions, but none of them with the authority of the Heritage Foundation. And by the way, the foundation was not just speaking for itself. There were scores of organizations on the Republican side of the aisle who basically were contributing to that report. And they've done this, by the way, for a number of years. And there was a lot of material in there that is very familiar material and hasn't changed over time. Yes?
My background is economics, and my career was in commercial banking. And one of the things that really disturbs me now, with particularly the rise of extreme wealth, is up until the 1930s, there were dozens and dozens of bank crashes, which in the 30s resulted in food lines and worldwide despair. And they put in the Glass-Steagall Act, and as a banker, that was one of my favorite things. which come up to Clinton was removed and replaced with something a lot weaker. The problem is and then also as a banker, I absolutely hated the FDIC because they were our auditors. And these, slobby people that didn't even dress in suits came in and picked apart my precious loans.
Told you what to do, basically.
Yes, telling us what to do, making us count the cash in the vault more than once, which is very boring. And then I lost my job in 2008 because of the crash and ended up working with the FDIC. And what was astounding to me was how dedicated they were, how much they cared about the safety of banks and there never being another crash or a meltdown of the banking system. And they are funded like other organizations. The banks pay for it. And needless to say, rich bankers would like to use your deposits in other ways that makes them unsafe. The other thing I wanted to say is while I worked at the FDIC, Sheila Bair, who is a Republican, was the head of the FDIC and was the most astounding manager I've ever worked for. She kept us informed. She gave us libraries of books so we understood all the banking things so we could understand everything. And she, while everybody else was running around, just quietly took the coverage of your bank account from $100,000 to $250,000. Just did it because she could. And it made a huge difference, okay? So to remove the Comstock Act and to have a tax on government agencies like this where people who are experienced and care are working. I mean, I don't want some president thinking it's a good idea to nuke hurricanes, being able to do it because all of a sudden half the nation thinks he should get his way instead of scientists. And so that's all I wanted to say is I hope we figure out a way to put the Comstock Act because these civil servants are dedicated, hard workers, intelligent, and even though I hated them for most of my career, there's a lot we don't know if you're on the other side. One other thing I wanted to say is Arizona solved the student problem in that in Arizona you can apply for a national voting rights. So students can vote in the presidential and actually our national congressional elections. But they can't take over and make marijuana illegal. Thank you. I really appreciate you.
Well, thank you. One thing I should say, by the way, in response to this, is that all of us worry about over-regulation. And any of you who run businesses will understand that sometimes there is over-regulation. And your costs go up just because you have to abide by regulations that you think really don't make any sense. So there's a balance that needs to be struck. Where that balance is in each individual case, I don't know. But I'm not sure you want a president of the United States to be able to control, for example, the Federal Reserve. If President Biden controlled the Federal Reserve, I think almost immediately he would say to them, cut interest rates because inflation is killing my candidacy. So cut them back make them much, much lower, and then he would crow about how much he did this for the public. I don't think you want that to occur. Or you don't want the Federal Drug Administration controlled by a president, either a Democratic or a Republican president, who is certifying the usage of particular drugs in a way that favors his or her campaign. Okay, question back there.
I'm an engineer by schooling and trade. You used the word right-wing many, many times. If Trump wins by 51%, or we get a House and Senate, or both, which is Republican, will you now refer to them as the majority, or will you continue to use the word right-wing?
Well, obviously not all Republicans, and maybe not most Republicans, are right-wing, quote, unquote. ideologically. The point that I was trying to make is that there are certain people in the Republican Party at its extreme, just as there are in the Democratic Party, who are ideologically out of kilter with the mainstream of the party. Most voters are not highly ideological. Most voters simply want there to be public policy that is made in such a way that they are benefited at home in their daily lives. But we, of course, need to be aware, and I showed this somewhat yesterday when I was talking about partisan polarization, that sometimes the extremes of a party can drive the average of a party in terms of its policy making and its policy positions. Okay, another question?
We have
one
time,
right
we have
here.
time for one
One
question.
more, and I'll be up here afterwards, so once we've cut things off, you'll just come up if you have further questions. Yes, go ahead.
I'd first like to preface my comments with the observation that I am not a Trumper. I parted ways with the Republican Party when George W. Bush took a hard right on social issues. You
Could you
mentioned from
speak
this,
more directly to the microphone? I'm not sure that everybody can hear you.
Okay.
Go ahead.
in your presentation, you talked about the, I think it was 20,000 candidates or whatever for political appointment in this report. Yes, I think they should be considered as potential candidates for over 4,000 established political appointed positions in our federal government. So it's nothing new that we have political appointees. We have over 4,000 of them.
That's correct, although under the Heritage Foundation report, they would reclassify many of the people who are protected by civil service laws as political appointees. And so it would expand, and I don't remember the exact number that they talk about, but the number is close to 20,000 rather than 4,000. And so if you can imagine a president, be it a President Biden or a President Trump, who all of a sudden has 20,000 top-level appointees of these various federal departments and agencies to make, and wants to appoint loyalists to those positions, it would really change the face of the executive branch, and change it in a major way.
I agree. I'd be much in favor of them changing most of those 4,000 plus to civil service. For one thing, they would make our government much more efficient. The average tenure of the current appointees is about half a year.
Yeah.
There's turnover, constant turnover in the highest level of our government.
By the way the British do it is that they have a very professionalized bureaucracy.
Right.
And only the top-level policymakers are subject to appointment by the Prime Minister.
I agree.
But everybody else is expected to be faithful to whatever the leaders want at any particular point in time,
Yes,
but
I
to
agree.
be professional as well.
I think the Brits are correct on that. The other issue of the imperial presidency, I think a big turning point was really made by Obama. You recall that there was a point in time when Obama couldn't get Congress to pass legislation that he wanted. And he said, I have a pen. Well, he used that pen very generously to put out an executive decree after executive decree after executive decree. Part of our problem is our Congress just isn't doing their job.
Yes. Yeah, by the way, in terms of executive orders, I'm not a big fan of executive orders. I think that Congress ought to do its job. And presidents shouldn't have to, Republicans or Democrats, shouldn't have to resort to executive orders, which are, of course, in force only when they're president. And then they can be easily dismantled later on. I wish Congress was more responsible than it has been. Democrats and Republicans in Congress. By the way, and you saw this in the decision the Supreme Court made on Monday, there, of course, was a criticism of regulation there. It has been in other cases as well, in fact, earlier cases there. And this criticism, I think, is in some ways warranted because what Congress did, it ducked the responsibility for writing legislation that was specific and basically said to the agencies and the departments, you basically figure out, or you should figure out how this applies to particular cases. And they went too far, in my judgment, in that direction, giving too much power to the administrative bodies and the executive branch. And the reason was they didn't want to take responsibility for hard decisions. And they really need to do more of that than they have in the past. Okay, I think that John is calling an end to this. Thank you. And I will stay up here. If you have further questions or comments, by all means, come up.